So, yeah, this isn't a technical talk. It's just kind of a thoughts about career and critical thinking and all that kind of stuff. So, I'll talk about some stories about my career and lessons that I learned while living it, and also some advice. I've been kind of watching, corporate culture is something that I'm quite passionate about these days, and I sort of watch and sort of notice what works and doesn't work. So some stories from my past. You know, I'd like to say I designed my first network protocol when I was 6 years old, and I've always been passionate about that. That's not at all true. If you asked me what I wanted to do, I certainly wouldn't have said designing computer network protocols. It was just a bunch of random events that led me to where I am today. And I love how it turned out. I probably would have been just as happy if I'd wound up in chemical engineering or something like that. So don't worry about the thing that you were born to do. You know, I just kind of go with the flow. And basically my advice to people who are agonizing, should I go into industry or academia? Which company should I go to? My advice is that you'll never have enough information to make an informed decision. So there's basically two types of people: those that would be happy with either decision, and those that would be unhappy with either decision. So school before college, like in high school, I loved logic problems and writing and humor and music, but I never took anything apart. You know, it never occurred to me. I would have assumed that I would break it or get electrocuted or something. So in that sense, I don't really fit the stereotype of an engineer. I knew nothing about computers at the time. And if I'd known more about computers at that point, if somebody had asked me, what do you want to be when you grow up? I would have said, anything as long as it doesn't involve computers. So frankly, I think this industry could use more people that hate computers. So yeah, when I design things for people like me. You know, I barely know how to use a smartphone. I just sort of want to have things work. So actually, when I was designing the network protocols at Digital, somebody told me that some customers have complained that my stuff is just way too boring, you know, because I like to just build it and it works. And they said, we have customers that really enjoy configuring things. So, you know, it shouldn't just be plug and it works. So I said, okay, fine. If they want knobs to play with, I'll put in knobs, but you don't have to touch the knobs. And even if you start diddling with the knobs, there's no setting that can hurt you. You know, it'll all work. So engineers should actually meet some humans. If they did, they would stop having programs ask questions like, do you want to display both the secure and the insecure items? I happen to know what that means, and it still doesn't make any sense. Or I was trying to install an email client, and I was asked, do you want POP or IMAP? I happen to know they're both email standards, but I don't know, why would I care? And it turns out it was super important. I had to speak whatever, I had to configure my machine to speak whatever the server was speaking. How am I supposed to know which, you know, right? So back to school. You know, I liked math and science. They were really fun and easy, but I was obsessed with getting straight A's, so I sort of spent most of my childhood on the other subjects. English, I did love it, but the subjective grading terrified me. And history was what I spent almost all of my homework on, because I have no memory at all. And so history was just memorizing a bunch of meaningless names and dates, which I would do. I would spend enough time so that I really could do it. 10 minutes after the test, it was all gone from my brain. I'm sort of very efficient. My mother used to help me memorize these things, and then like a week after the test, she'd say, "Oh, you were just studying that in history," and I'd look at her blankly because it was all gone. You know, if I have to remember, you know, an extra thing, then I'll have to forget something kind of more important, like my name or something. Yeah. So the way I took my first computer programming class, so a teacher in high school noticed there was a programming class at a nearby college, and the timing worked out that she could sign a few of us up and drive us over there. I mean, this was all volunteer on her part. I mean, teachers are just awesome. So, after years of having been the top student in any math or science classes, which I wasn't even happy about, frankly. You know, I'd walk into, okay, now it's physics, I'm gonna be the best student. I actually had some fantasy that some boy would do better than me at some math or science thing, and my plan was to fall in love with him and marry him. But after all of that, I walk into this computer programming class, and all the students were talking about how they had built ham radios when they were 7. I had no clue what a ham radio was. I was pretty sure I wouldn't be able to turn one on and use it if I saw it. And then they were asking questions with fancy words like input. I had no idea what that was. And my mind completely shut down. I got nothing out of this class because I kind of assumed that I was so many years behind that, so this was kind of the first time in a class. Luckily, you know, the grade didn't matter for anything. Yeah, so I wound up learning nothing. But it makes me a better teacher because I understand the sense of panic that can prevent people from learning when there was sort of no reason why I wouldn't have been the best one in the class if I hadn't just started out assuming that I was too far behind. So most of success at learning is self-confidence. But I did learn to program. How did that happen? Well, I was taking a physics class in college, and the TA said to me, Radia, I need a programmer for a project. Would you like to be my programmer? And I said, I don't know how to program. And he said, yes, I know. That's why I'm asking you, because I have no money to pay you. And if you knew how to program, you'd expect to get paid. And you know, I was doing very well in the class. So he said, I'm sure you're very bright. I'm sure you'll be able to learn. And to be honest, the reason that I agreed is that I had a friend who knew how to program. So I figured he could bail me out if, and that's how I learned. Continuing with my career path, I went to grad school right after undergraduate, like you would expect. I was in math at the time. I never took any computer science classes. And I did, oh, by the way, math. I'm a firm believer in majoring in math because it teaches you to think cleanly. Whereas when I went back to graduate school later on, I went in computer science, and sort of the fuzziness of it drove me crazy. You can fly in from Mars and go to a math class and say, what's a number? And the professor will not blink. He'll give you a very clear answer. Whereas you walk into a computer class and they're waxing rhapsodic about object-oriented programming, and you say, well, what is that? And it's like, everyone knows. Well, I don't, you know. It's like, well, it's like good or something. Anyway, so I was in math, and I did everything but my thesis. I knew how to take classes, but yeah. I was at MIT in the math department, and they were extremely unhelpful. You had to find your own advisor. So after I had done everything but that, I would knock on doors and say, hi, I need an advisor. And all of the professors said, well, I'm a big, important, busy person, which was kind of discouraging. But my perception at the time was that everybody else was in graduate school because they were smart. I had just gotten into graduate school because I studied really hard. I couldn't imagine doing original research, just some other species did that. So yeah, as it turns out, around that time, luckily I didn't spend too much time looking for an advisor, an old friend said, "Are you enjoying grad school?" And I said, "No, I have no idea how to get started on a thesis." And he said, "Oh, come join our group." And that group happened to be designing protocols for the packet radio network. And I discovered I loved it. What I really love about sort of routing protocols, distributed algorithms, is you have all these computers doing their own thing based on what they locally know, and somehow it fits together like a beautiful symphony. But then how I got my job at Digital, which was exactly the right job at the right point in history. You know, this is at the dawn of networking. So there was a conference that happened periodically, and the person who ran it said, "Oh, there's this important unsolved routing problem I want everyone to think about." So I thought about it, looked at things from different angles, which is how I do, and then I said, "Oh, I know how to do it." I got myself on the agenda for the next time. I was so excited. And so I present, I said, "Here's the problem, here's the solution." Nobody asked any questions. And at the end of the conference, the person running it said, "Remember everybody, there's this important unsolved routing problem I want you to all think about," which is what I had presented. So then this guy from Digital came up to me and he said, "That was incredible. We've been thinking about that problem for a long time. Once you see the solution, it's obvious. So we'll use it in DECnet." And I said, "Oh, great." And then he said, "Are you happy professionally?" And I said, "I guess so." And he said, "Well, you were just completely ignored. Didn't that bother you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm used to it. Everyone ignores me." So he said, "No, you have to come to Digital." And that was how I, sort of as a 20-something-ish person, was given the job to be the single person designing that portion of networking at Digital. You know, it didn't. So later, for the weirdest reasons you'll ever hear, I went back to grad school and got my PhD. Actually, if we're not too concerned with time, I could tell this story. Why did I go back to grad school? Well, I had little kids. I had like babies. And I always had the world's worst cold. No matter where I went, I had to carry a waste paper basket and a large box of tissues. And it was unbelievably disgusting with my constantly blowing my nose and the loudest sneeze you can imagine. So I would stay home for a few days, feel a little better, go back. And I just couldn't shake this cold. So I eventually broke down and went to a doctor, which I never do. And I said, yeah, I know I'm doing too much. I'm not getting enough sleep. I don't want to hear it. None of that's going to change. Give me something to get rid of my cold. And he said, "Well, how long have you had it?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know, 3 or 4 years." And he said, "Yeah, that's not a cold. That's allergies." And I realized I must be allergic to cigarette smoke, which I had never been exposed to before. But back then, inside the building, people smoked at their desk. So I complained to personnel, and I said, "This is making me sick." And they said, "Okay, they'll make sure nobody in any cubicle next to mine is a smoker." But that wasn't going to help much. So then I was telling my colleagues, I'm going to have to quit. I can't be sick all the time. And they said, "Oh, be patient. Digital is working on the smoking issue." So back then, Digital had this amazing program where they would send you to 2 years of graduate school, all expenses paid, full salary, no strings attached. And so I decided, okay, I'll go hang out in grad school for a couple years and let them work on the smoking issue. So indeed, I got my PhD in 2 years in computer science. And when I came back, they had solved the smoking issue by issuing a memo that said, quote, "Don't smoke in the building," unquote. I have no idea why it took them 2 years, but Thank you, thank you, Philip Morris. So, I was also worried, going back to graduate school, that, boy, I would have forgotten everything that I had known, which was true, I had. Plus, it was computer science instead of math. And I was afraid everyone would kind of stare at me and say, what's this old lady doing in the class? But as it turns out, like a week in, some poor guy asked me out on a date, and I said, well, that's very flattering, but I'm actually an old lady and I have kids and whatever. But I discovered it was so much easier the second time, because I realized if the teacher is droning on and on and on, ask a question. They really appreciate it. Whereas before, I kind of assumed everyone else is following this. But yeah. And every time I had a test, I would panic for the first 20 minutes, leafing through it until I finally settled down and linearly did the test. But when I went back as a mature woman, I realized that if you've been following the class, you'll do fine on the test. I had been teaching as well, and I know how hard it is to come up with homework and test problems. So I was sort of curious when I did a test, oh, what kind of problems will he come up with? So, but the way, no matter what I did in my career, nobody ever sort of noticed me. You know, it might change the industry and they might actually be using everything, but nobody sort of attributed things to me until I happened to have written the book Interconnections, which sort of describes layer 2 and 3. And it became the book that everybody would learn from. You know, anyone at like Cisco or whatever would have that book on their bookshelf. And then after that, when people would be introduced to me, they'd take one look and be bored already, and they'd say, oh, you know, this is Radia Perlman. And then the name would, oh, that's the same as the book. And so it's like, oh, wow, okay. So that was kind of cool. Actually, you get so proud of writing, you know, after you wrote a book. The first time it came out was at a major networking conference, and so I was getting on the airplane, and I saw somebody on the airplane reading the book. And so I was so excited, I said, hey, that's my book. And the guy got very upset. He said, no, it isn't. I have the receipt right here. But another story was once I had like a 4-hour between planes at Chicago airport, and the airport was really very empty for some reason, and I wasn't hungry enough to eat, and I was too tired to do anything useful, so I'm wandering around in a daze, and then I noticed a group of men talking to each other, and I thought I heard some words like bridges, routers, but I wasn't sure because I was too far away. One of them had a book on his lap, and all I could see was the edges because there were papers on top, and it was the right color to be my book. So I was just really curious. So in this empty airport, I maneuver myself with my carry-on bags to sit right next to them, at which point they stopped talking and they're staring at me. And so I was embarrassed and I realized I was being bizarre, but I said, I was just curious, what is that book? So he pulls it out, that's my book. I said, oh, I'm Radia Perlman. So they all turn white, and then when one of them recovered enough to talk, he said, oh, we're in a panic trying to prepare a customer presentation, and right before you walked in, one of us said, if only the author of that book were here. So I said, oh, it comes with the book. You wish for me, I appear. How can I help? So I helped them prepare, sign their book, and I've never had more fun at an airport. But now on to corporate culture. It must be safe to ask questions. Now, an example of the opposite is the group that I was in at Digital, where the culture was sort of dominated by these very aggressive people that everyone assumed were geniuses because they were tall or something, I don't know. But my stuff worked, theirs didn't. But if you asked a question, especially in public, one of them would snap at you, if you don't know that, you don't belong in this group. So can you imagine? So yes, you should answer questions very graciously. If somebody asks me something like, what's a public key? I won't say, how can you not know that? I'll say, oh, it is the coolest thing, and I can't believe I have the honor to be the first person to introduce you to it. But a more subtle thing is when you get to be kind of senior, you sort of expect that you're supposed to know everything. And if you actually believe you know everything, really you should retire. But this notion that you're afraid to let the rest of the people know that you don't know everything, if you're truly a role model, you should be the first person to ask naive questions to show that you don't know everything, you're perfectly comfortable about that, and that it's safe to ask questions. Okay, so I don't know. I hate computers, as I said. Okay. So it also must be easy to learn things. And at technical companies, when you go to technical talks, they just drown you in acronyms. And for some reason, org charts. It's like, why do I need to see the org chart for this technical talk? But whatever. It's very hard to absorb any information from that. And it makes the audience feel stupid. And it's just why talk if you're not actually conveying information? So, yeah. Buzzwords drive me crazy. So things like SDN, or object-oriented programming. It's very, it doesn't really mean anything. It's useful for impressing customers, so I guess that's good. And they don't necessarily actually mean anything. So for instance, yeah, right. They traumatize most engineers. And people who are sure they know what these things are have different opinions about what it is. So if you actually want to have a technical discussion, try to be way more specific than just using the buzzword. Cross-fertilization. It's really important for people to talk to people outside of their group. And it's very difficult to make this happen in an industry of introverts. So I do that, but it's like people find it very weird. When I'm just sort of waiting online at the cafeteria or something, I'll just say to the people around, oh, so, what are you working on? Which is usually great. One time, I was trying to get the attention of the person in front of me online so I could have this sort of chat. And so I got his attention, and in his model of the world, in his introverted brain, the only theory he had for why somebody behind him in line was getting his attention was that he must have cut in line. So he panicked and he said, oh my God, did I cut in line? And he raced off. Before I could say anything, and he'll probably never go to a cafeteria ever again. So now I'm sort of careful to talk to the person behind me in line instead. But also, the saddest thing I see is engineers go to the cafeteria, buy their food, look out at the people sitting out there, and if they don't know anybody, they scurry back to their office and eat by themselves. And make the cafeteria have certain tables that are clearly marked that this is for talking to other people, not for sort of just having a chat in your own group. Mentoring. So everyone is sort of always into mentoring, but it always, the very formal things where they set you up with one person and you're supposed to meet with them regularly, it seems very unfair. I mean, you should be helping everybody. Plus, the whole notion of a hierarchy, I am the mentor, you are the mentee, makes me sort of uncomfortable. I think everybody should be mentoring everybody about what you're capable of mentoring them about. So if you want to know how to write a book, yes, I can help you. If you want to know which kind of car to get, yeah, go away, I have no clue. Oh yeah, and then the other thing is you can think about mentoring as having the wise senior people pass on wisdom to the other people, and that's a fine thing. But to really grow the more junior people, the most powerful thing you could do is ask them for advice. So, hints for problem solving and communication. Somebody once asked me for advice on how to be a good speaker, and what I said just rang very true. So what I said was, given a topic you know something about, and a level of the audience, and an amount of time, you should be able to come up with an appropriate talk. Sounds simple, but most people don't do that. They have like one slide deck that they use for their project, that they'll use the same deck no matter whether it's a 3-day tutorial or a 10-minute talk or whatever, I don't know. And problem solving. One kind of reason why I work the way that I do is because I have such a small memory. So other people got through class by remembering what the teacher wanted you to say, and they'd parrot it back on the test. I couldn't do that. I had to derive everything from the 2 basic principles I could remember. So when I approach a problem, I get rid of all of the irrelevant details to get to the conceptual heart of the one thing that you know, is trying to be solved, and that works much better than when you sort of worry about all the irrelevant details of the particular implementation. So some womany thoughts, because we're at a womany thing. Why are there so few technical women? There really are very few senior technical women. I'm almost always the only one. You know, the more senior you get, the fewer there are. Just a funny story, since they're not warning me that I should hurry up, which was one time our company had bought another company, and so we were having a big meeting with 50 of us in the room, I being the only woman, which isn't unusual, trying to plan a project around the new company. Well, the person sitting next to me was from the new company and had never been in the building. So coming up to the first break, he asked me, "Can you show me where the bathroom is?" And I said, "Sure, but I have my own private bathroom." And he said, "Really?" And I said, "Yes, I don't know quite why, you know, the company insists on that. I think it's because I'm a fellow." So then he was so impressed that the fellows got their own private bathrooms. And then, of course, I walked him to the men's room and walked right across the hall, and he saw me go into the women's one, and he laughed. So it doesn't seem to be changing, you know, which is kind of surprising, you know, because people are working so hard at it and, you know, sponsoring all these events. So I asked some senior women who decided to switch to the management track, "Why did you do that?" And there are so many things that they could have said that would have been fine with me. I'm just really good at working with women, or with people, I'm sorry. And they needed someone in that role, and there was nobody else. But every single one of them gave me the answer, "I wasn't smart enough to stay on the technical role." So that was kind of, that's just so terrifying. Yeah, why are there not more women? Well, when I talk to women who, you know, like young, you know, like high school or college kids, who don't want to go into engineering, they say, "Oh, you know, it's just so boring." And, you know, or "I want to do something socially relevant." Well, high tech is the ideal place to do that sort of stuff. And also, you kind of have this image of what, you know, they think they wouldn't be good at it because they weren't someone that, you know, built computers when they were little and so forth, or that they only have one idea in mind. Well, it turns out if you have some skill, like you can actually talk to people, or you're artistic, or whatever, you can find an ecological niche that would make you very useful. There's also sort of the whole inner circle of executives hiring their friends from college or whatever that kind of keep outsiders out. or the subconscious impression. So when you interview someone, they just don't strike you as an engineer. They just don't look the part. You're not doing it on purpose, but right. It doesn't remind them of a younger version of themselves or whatever. And then there's the perception today that there's favoritism towards women. There's certainly the belief that any woman can walk up to any high-tech company and say, hire me, and the person will say, why should we hire you? And you say, I'm female. And they go, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't notice, come right in. And that's just not the way that it works. It's sort of more the subconscious kind of thing that overrides any sort of preferential treatment that they're sort of trying to do. So yeah, I got a funny thing. I got a recruitment letter from a high-tech company saying, we are particularly interested in you as a female thought leader, which I find like really insulting. It's like, I'm good enough for a regular job. Why do you have to throw that in? But I wasn't interested anyway, so I didn't reply. But my fantasy reply was, thank you for your interest in me as a, quote, female thought leader, unquote. Although my credentials as a thought leader are impeccable, I must warn you I'm not that qualified as a female. I can't walk in heels, I have no clothing sense, and I'm not particularly decorative. What aspects of female are important to this job? So there's a lot of things that are sort of visible that reinforce the impression that women are always needing to get helped and have, like there was this thing called Take Your Daughter to Work Day. I'm so pleased they changed it to Take Your Child to Work Day. I'm sure the Take Your Daughter to Work made zero difference to any girl growing up on what they chose. But the first time they had it, my daughter was like 10 and my son was like 7. And it was going to be this great thing with tours of the labs and make your own sundaes and stuff like that. So I was obviously going to bring my daughter, but what was I going to tell my son? You can't go because you're a male chauvinist oppressing pig. So sometimes diversity makes things hard, and we should at least recognize that. So languages. I have a friend who works in a group that almost everybody is Indian, and at lunch they sit and they speak Hindi, and he feels really left out. He doesn't feel like a member of the group. Another one is interests. One time I was at one of these events for kind of executives, and I'm right, and the highest order of geeks also went, but there was, you'd get your breakfast and then you'd sit at a table and you'd chat. Well, I sat at a bad choice of table. Everyone at the table had their own airplane. And so they were comparing features on their airplanes. I was so bored, but I thought it might look rude to pick up my tray and go someplace else. So I was just hoping they would stop, and they wouldn't. They could have gone on forever talking about these features. So eventually there was a lull in the conversation, and I said, I fly on airplanes sometimes. I know how to work the seatbelt. And one of them sort of with good humor said, oh, I could never figure that out. And I said, oh, they give this little speech in the beginning if you pay attention. But then like group activities. This woman came up to me once and asked for advice. So this was a really tiny woman. And she had just been hired into a group of incredibly burly guys, and what they liked to do for group activities was touch football and all these kinds of things. And if she even tried to do that with them, they would stay as far away from her as possible because they were afraid they'd step on her or something. So, I said, well, why don't you suggest an activity that you could do too, like maybe a potluck? And she said, she actually suggested that to the manager, and the manager said, unfortunately, nobody else in the group would want to do that. So it's kind of interesting when you really mix different types of people. So what is diversity? Why is it important? And I claim it's not really about skin color and body shapes. It's looking at the world in different ways, and you mesh all of these talents. So rather than expecting everybody in the group to be good at everything, instead of worrying about the fact that you're bad at communicating, but you're great at writing code, find somebody else in the group who's good at that, and then this ideal team will supplement each other's strengths. So there's a Dilbert cartoon about what is an engineer, which is amusing, but I think it's very toxic. So what it is, you know, the parents bring Dilbert to a pediatrician and say, you know, the young Dilbert, oh, what do I do? You know, wherever we leave him, he just takes things apart and whatever. And then the pediatrician said, well, the bad news, it's incurable, but what it is he's an engineer. So the problem is that's not the only type of engineer. And yeah. So, yeah. Okay, so in school versus life, I sort of noticed this. In school, the emphasis is the work must be your own. In a company, the important thing is to get the job done. So ask for help, give other people help. And so school kind of gives you this bad habit of working independently. In academia, novelty is important. Whereas in industry, don't try to do something new if existing things work. A good engineer should understand the stuff and choose the best solution, and only sort of do something new if it's really better or needed. So fostering and practicing critical thinking. At least in the world of networks, a lot of what we all know is actually not true. So the way networking tends to be taught, which kind of bothers me, is memorize these standards documents or the arcane details of a particular implementation. It's as if TCP/IP arrived on tablets from the sky in its awesome perfection. Nothing else ever existed. And if you ever do talk about something else, it's just to make some snide comment about what idiots the people are that designed anything other than TCP/IP. Oh, okay. So my philosophy on teaching and how I write my books is you look at a conceptual problem like, okay, you have to plug into a network, how do you get a unique address? And I say, here, there's 7 different ways I can think of. Here are the pros and cons of each of them. And AppleTalk did this, IPX did that. And so some people say, well, there's stuff in the book that I don't need to know. But I claim if all you care about is IPv4, you'll have a much deeper understanding if you can look at alternatives. So standards, things are so confusing. When there's 2 similar things, let's say Ethernet and InfiniBand, I like to get to the heart of what's really different about them. But nobody else does that. You can either find someone who's an expert at A or an expert at B. And if you ask somebody who's an expert at A how it compares with B, they say A is awesome and B sucks. You ask a B person, you get the opposite thing. But then if you discover something better about B and tell the A people, oh, it has these features, well, no problem. The A people steal the ideas, and nobody cares what's inside their spec. They just want to get credit. So the way that I tell people is that it's natural to think of standards bodies as well-educated technologists carefully weighing engineering trade-offs, but a much more accurate way to think of them is as drunken sports fans. You know, my team. So, okay, so let me, so think critically, don't believe everything you hear or read in textbooks, don't repeat things you don't understand. and know what problem you're solving before you try to solve it. So in my book, I have these little boxes that I call real-world examples to illustrate a point I'm making. So for instance, on the scalability thing, I talk about the wine glass clicking protocol, which works okay with like 4 people, but with 11 and everyone has to click everybody else, whatever. But this is an absolutely true anecdote, and it's everybody's favorite in my book. What I'm trying to illustrate is you should know what problem you're solving before you try to solve it. Whereas some people sort of vaguely hear a couple of cases, start writing code, it doesn't work in all cases, you have to write more code, they wind up with this monstrosity that, you know, doesn't work in all cases and so forth. So the anecdote that will cement in your mind why you should know what you're doing before you try to solve it is when my son was 3, he ran up to me crying, holding up his hand, saying, my hand, my hand. So I took it and kissed it a few times. What's the matter, honey? Did you hurt it? And he said, no, I got pee on it. So, thank you.